Good morning, everyone. We live in times where the most important currency that we have is ideas. And these ideas can only be developed through thoughtful discussions and deliberation. And we believe that there is no better way to achieve this than to debate. Debating teaches us to differ and it opens up our mind. It makes us believe that even if our opinion is not the most important one in the room, it is our own and it must be at the table and our hand should be up. As it is rightly said, the genius of a person is reflected in their journey, and such was the journey of Sri Sanjay Shrivastava. An alumnus of our college, he was more than just a student. From bringing laurels to the institution through his intellect and eloquent speeches, to being one of the most popular prime ministers of the student parliament, the Republic of Hindu, to bringing into existence Mecca, one of the most prestigious college fest of the University of Delhi, and then serving in the coveted Indian Administrative Services for 20 years. Thus, as the topper of the university and his batch of IAS, his academic prowess is an inspiration for one and all. He believed in the power of having a strong conscience, and today we take a small step in doing justice to his legacy of academic brilliance, oratorical skills, and pursuit for excellence by preserving the spirit and sanctity of this activity. With that, we welcome you all to the third edition of annual Sanjay Shrivastava Memorial Debate. For the motion today, we have taken the theme of the current pandemic, COVID-19. And as we know that in a status quo that is plagued by COVID, norms regarding international travel are changing and changing very fast. Our motion for this round deals exactly with the debate surrounding such policy changes. So our motion hereby is, this House would make vaccine passports compulsory for international travel. For the debate to start, let me introduce the panel of judges that we have with us today. Judging in breakout room 1, we have Neha Satyaprakash, an alumna of Miranda House. Neha has won many accolades as a debater and adjudicator across circuits. In breakout room 2, we have another prominent debater, Ajat Shatru Singh Rawat, an alumnus of Shahid Sukhdev College of Business Studies. We hope all the teams have named themselves according to the naming convention as mentioned in the tech guide. Please wait as we allocate you to the respective rooms. We hope you have a nice time debating. Thank you, everyone.
All right. So I'll just read out the basic rules and the guidelines for the teams. So the motion before the House is that this House would make vaccine passports compulsory for international travel. All the speakers will have 4 minutes of speaking time. There won't be any interjections, and we'll be timing you. We have a timer here. We'll be sharing the timer on the screen with you, so as to make sure that there are no problems on that end. Again, we tell you that the use of any unparliamentary language is strictly prohibited. So I think without any further delay, let's begin with the preliminary round of the third annual Sanjay Shrivastava Memorial Debate. I would now like to request the speaker for the motion from Team Dayal Singh College to take the stage.
Am I visible?
Yeah, you're visible.
So if my voice lags or if my voice breaks, could you just unmute yourself and tell me?
Sure, we'll do that.
Right. So I'll start at the count of 3, 3, 2, 1. A very good morning to everyone. This House would make vaccine passports compulsory for international travel. I-SI proposition stands strongly for the motion. Living in a world struck by a global pandemic has definitely handcuffed us when it comes to our freedom of movement. What has added to this is the potential carriers of the virus are not being monitored with vigilance. We could say that this is the reason an epidemic has turned into a global pandemic. We hear the news every day talking about new strains of the SARS-CoV-2, whether it be the Wuhan strain, the England strain, or the South African strain, or the Japanese strain. We hear how each strain is slightly different, slightly more deadlier than the other. And it makes me wonder, how did so much mutation take place in the first place? The latest strain that has been found in India is a mixture of most of these strains that I just mentioned. So, how did so many different strains and mutations develop globally? Well, the only answer to this could be unregulated international travel. Our hurry to open the world up without decisive efforts has cost us immensely. Desperate times requires desperate measures. That is why vaccine passports could be a key weapon in combating the fresh spread of new waves and new variants. I know vaccine passports aren't ideal, but we do not live in an ideal world. And let me tell you why these vaccine passports are necessary and why we need to make them compulsory. First, they allow regulation and segregation of potential carriers. Vaccine passports basically act like seals of approval which notify the authorities that a person is immunized and cannot be a potential carrier who is a super spreader. The second is they act like an all access pass when it comes to international travel and travel in general. Seeing the current world, seals of immunization, i.e., vaccine passports, will be as important as ID proofs, and thus carrying them would assure access to different aspects of travel, like whether it be sporting venues or any venues in general. Third, it puts countries at lesser risk of further waves, and this is probably the most important point. We all know the so-called smaller countries have been tormented by this virus. The virus has overwhelmed the medical, social, and economic infrastructure of these countries. And international travel without vaccine passports would put these countries at a greater risk of new waves, which would definitely overwhelm their infrastructure. They may or may not recover from this shock. And fourth, is it acts like an impetus which would promote mass immunization. Making passport vaccines compulsory would directly promote more people to immunize themselves, which will be a major step towards normalcy. Also, an important thing to note here is that an immunized person cannot be a super spreader. Therefore, a passport vaccine is an insurance which provides a sense of safety and assurance to the countries. Also, let me talk about SARS-CoV-2. SARS-CoV-2 spreads through respiratory particles from an infected person's throat and nose. A vaccine reduces the duration of the infection, the amount of virus in the respiratory tract, or how often an infected person may cough decreases. Thus, the likelihood of him being a transmitter thus reduces significantly. Fulfillment of all these criteria is what is assured by vaccine passports. Vaccine passports do not guarantee safety, but this is a game of probability and they just make the spread less probable. And let me also mention that this is not a new phenomena. Even during the outbreak of the smallpox, vaccine certificates were enforced before travel, and people even back then agreed to the fact that public health cannot be jeopardized for unregulated international travel. So I just like to reiterate again and say that we do not live in an ideal world, ladies and gentlemen. And vaccine passports are necessary because we cannot risk countries, smaller countries, we cannot risk new variants, we cannot risk an other wave. That is why I'm very, very proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech. I now invite the opposition speaker from Dayal Singh College I invite the opposition speaker speaking against the motion from the team to take the stage.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. You're visible.
Please. I'll start at the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. So the adjudicators, I want you to take note of the fact that we are discussing here about a policy, and whenever we are talking about a certain policy, we need to realize that we should always take the weakest stakeholders of that, who would be impacted by that policy, to be the actual ones to decide whether that policy is good or not. First of all, my whole case would be talking about two particular contexts. One would be about the social context of the if this is implemented, and other one is the medical context, which I will be talking about. By the social context, I want your attention to be driven to major 3 points. What would be repercussion of this on the different countries across the globe? Second would be how the natives of different country living across the borders would be impacted by this. And third is how it would hamper the vaccination process, which the proposition has been proposing, and how it would actually create chaos rather than solve it. solving the problem. First of all, I would like to quote a recent report published in the United States, which highlighted the fact that 85 poor countries would not be getting vaccination until 2023. It means 2 years from now. What does this point to is there are 85 countries and more who would not be getting vaccination. Why should it matter? Is because these are the countries which are actually providing unskilled labor to the world in the great amount. So there are two repercussions. First is the economic repercussion, that we would not be having unskilled labor at for us, and second would be the we owe a duty of consideration to the fact that there are people who are not capable enough or not cannot afford the vaccine right now, but restricting international travel only on this fact would be discriminatory for them. Second is, we saw how people were stuck in different countries during the pandemic, and how Indian government and governments across the globe went out to reach to their people in different countries and brought them back home. Now, if this vaccine passports become the compulsory thing for international travel, but what would happen? We know every government has first duty to serve their native citizens and then only the foreigners. Every government does that. What would have happened is the people stuck in different nations would not have been brought back to their nations by their government, only owing to the fact that vaccine would become compulsory and it would take larger time, which would again be a discriminatory process to a discriminatory thing to happen. Third, I want your attention to the fact that how Aadhaar card, when became one nation, one card identity, how it led to making of several fake Aadhaar cards, and how the government is still dwindling due to that. Similarly, when the vaccine passports are made compulsory for the travel, I want you to note this word compulsory. What would happen? That fake vaccine passports would become a major thing which would take place. Two things. First would be the corruption and how people would actually pay and how bribery would start happening for the making of vaccine passports. And two, how the government would be unable to actually differentiate between who has been actually been vaccinated and who has not been, and hence hampering the whole vaccination process. This was the social context I present before you. The medical context and the underlying fact that the proposition is coming with is that it would actually stop the spread. Medically flawed statement, because vaccine is not a panacea. We have to understand that there have been several cases noted where the people who were vaccinated were found to be COVID positive. So it means that there is a chance, there is a big probability that these people can be potential carriers too. Second is, vaccine is just one parameter of immunity. There can be herd immunity, there can be antibodies in those people who have recovered from the virus, and one is the vaccine. So vaccine is not the only thing, only way to get immune. So again, this is a medically flawed statement. And how do you differentiate between those immune people who have who are having antibodies or who have actually developed herd immunity? All in all, what I want to say is the proposition's case and what the proposition has been proposing is medically flawed and socially evil. Whereas what I say is, if the travels, it is not made compulsory, it would be in the benefit of the society as a whole, and medically as well, it would be a viable option to not compulsory make it compulsory for the vaccine passport for international travel. With that, I rest my case. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the speaker for their fine speech. I now invite, I would now request the speaker for speaking for the motion from Team Motilal Nehru College to take the stage.
Hi, am I audible? Cool. I'll just start.
Can you switch on your camera, please?
Yes, this English. I don't have that background. Is it fine if I do it without that background?
I think it should be.
Am I visible?
Yeah, you are.
Cool. Okay, I'll start on the count of 3, 2, 1, go. Judges, being an active member of the society, I believe it's my responsibility towards mankind to address the loopholes and flaws in the status quo. Excuse me, the timer isn't going on.
Sijani, can you start the timer? Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Sorry. Judges, being an active member of the society, I believe it's my responsibility towards the mankind to address the loopholes and flaws in the status quo. Hence, I, Paritosh Mishra, would like to propose a move that makes vaccination passports mandatory for international travels. But before addressing the benefits of the policy, let's understand the basic idea behind it. Why am I specifically talking about international travels? It's pretty much accurate to assume that majority of people are rational. They already know about current scenario, and specifically talking about the second mutation of COVID and the sudden rises in the cases, right? They acknowledge the gravity of the situation and will only choose to air travel only when it's needed, or they have no other alternative left, right? Since the fewer people, hence it's easy for them to target and easily identify and can be applied for these procedures, right? But why I'm only talking about vaccination of these specific people? Given the past precedents, we can say with confidence that air travel has been majorly responsible for spreading of virus. You have seen that mutations coming from Italy, you have seen mutations coming from China, right? There are responsible there are plenty of examples to prove this fact. Hence, in order to mitigate further spreading and damage, I believe it's absolutely necessary to go ahead with this move. But why? But what's the current system and why isn't it working, right? You need to understand this also. Right now, if you have to travel abroad, you need to show a report to prove stating that you have negative. Let's understand how it fails as a solution to the problem at multiple levels. First, we think at high percentage, it has a high percentage chances of getting a false negative, hence completely rendering the move ineffective. That is, you can get a false negative report, or people can manufacture a false negative report. Happens a lot, we have seen them a lot, right? Secondarily, even if you're genuinely negative, there's no guarantee that you will stay negative through your time period of the journey, right? Hence, people getting vaccinated acts as a safety net for them. Thirdly, since these tests can be performed in almost any labs and clinic, there's hardly any nationalized record to verify verify the results. Hence, this incentives the people to forge the reports, right? Like I talked about. Therefore, we can only when only one single authority will be responsible for getting people vaccinated and maintaining the record, they can easily cross-check genuineness of that vaccination passport, right? We think the check and balance system then comes in play. Hence, it's absolutely necessary to address all the shortcomings and make a decision and make vaccination passport mandatory, right? We as a humankind already have suffered so much, far too many casualties are reported, and it's high time to take this initiative in this regard. Don't let opposition come ahead and argue the fact that this movement inaccessible to people and can easily be applied to inaccessible to people, because we think people can easily apply for vaccination passport along with their visas and travel. It would look like people going ahead and asking for visa, but also asking for vaccination transport, right? There are numerous benefits to the policy. I'm going to name 5 benefits. Number 1 benefit: improves the current system, that is the system of forgery and the system of no nationalized record. Second, it improves the rate at which vaccination of the entire country takes place. That is, now people who are going ahead and only taking tests now also goes ahead and gets vaccinated because they need to travel outward. Third, curbs the spread of travel via air spread. Like we have seen that from UK, people come to India and they have spread the new mutation that was found in UK. We think that is something that can be curbed through vaccination passport. Fourthly, we think instead of increasing the queue at test labs, they can directly go for vaccination. That is then going ahead and not over like giving overtime to like these people to the people who are testing them. Fifthly, and most important, people who are skeptical about vaccination gets an incentive to go ahead and get vaccinated. That is, now they know that if they want to travel forward, they will go ahead and have to get vaccinated. For all those reasons, we think that vaccination passport are very, very important. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you, Speaker. I thank you for your fine speech. I now invite the speaker speaking against the motion from Team Motilal Nehru to take the stage.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Right. I'll just start in 3, 2, 1. Right. Panel, in a world where inequality is rising at a very high rate and where there are concerns of big countries dominating small countries and hegemonizing the small countries, big countries making small countries even colonies of there, we see example of what China does in there, right? At a point in time where these are the problems that exist in the world, it becomes essentially important to go ahead and think about the kind of harms that a policy can bring to the small nations, or a policy can bring to the least person or to the last person who's going to get affected by it, right? I go ahead and oppose this kind of motion, and let me just go ahead and start talking about the kind of status quo that is there, right? In status quo, to stop the spread of virus from one country to other country, we have some of the measures that we are taking, right? In terms of air bubble agreements between countries where to and fro travel can take place. Secondly, in terms of the kind of negative RT-PCR test reports which you need to present. And thirdly, the kind of mandatory quarantine facility which is compulsory for the people who come from international travel, right? We see that in a scenario where these all measures are being taken by the countries to stop the spread of virus internationally, the question then becomes, what is the kind of exclusivity that the vaccine passports provide to you, in terms of whether it tells you that if you are making something compulsory, then the spread of virus internationally becomes zero, right? If this is something that the vaccine passport does, it is okay for us then to go ahead and think about that policy. But in a scenario it fails to does this thing and brings certain sort of harms, we think it's very important to neglect this kind of policy, right? But now let us go ahead and talk about what are the kind of harms or what happens once this policy gets implemented, right? There are a lot of countries which are especially poor and middle income countries which have little or no vaccines with them, right? As my fellow colleague said that according to a report of United Nations, 84 countries won't be getting any sort of vaccine until 2023. What essentially then happens, in a scenario where these countries which are poor and middle income countries don't get vaccines, there is a sort of discrimination that you go ahead and place against them in terms of international travel, right? This leads to a creation of two-tier society basically, and the people who are at the brunt of it are people who belong to countries like Nigeria or many of African and sub-Saharan countries, right? But secondarily, even for an international policy of this kind to take place, we need to have an equal ground, we need to have the same base, right? What is it happening in this particular scenario? No, because even the countries that have started vaccinating their people, the pace of vaccination is not same in those particular countries, right? On one hand, you have Israel and UAE vaccinating over 85 to 90% of their population. On the other hand, you have countries like India who are even vaccinating, but even not 1 or 2% of their population is vaccinated, right? So this policy is not opening the same level field for everyone who is involved in this particular thing, right? But thirdly, is this kind of policy a permanent solution? No, this kind of policy is not at all a permanent solution. Many scientific reports coming ahead that vaccines immunity can last to a maximum of 6 months to 1 year. Are you going to go ahead and again roll out this sort of vaccine passport after a year or after a year or two, right? We don't think this is something that can go ahead and like simply be done with, because this is again and again snatching the opportunities from people who particularly belong to underdeveloped or less privileged countries, which are largely Asian, African, and all sort of things. But lastly, in terms of a policy of this kind to be go ahead, you need to think about what can be the kind of implementation of this policy, right? Now, since this is something that you're talking about globally, the domination of this policy will again largely be by those international countries such as UK, US, Israel, and first world countries, and they'll be able to mechanize or they'll be able to prioritize their needs in terms of framing of this policy over the needs of other small countries, right? We see when there are these kind of grave harms that arise to this policy, I don't see any reason to go ahead and make this compulsory vaccine passport for international travels, right? But also in terms of what the opposition talks about, they say about that incentive mil jayega and all sort of thing. I don't think this is something that is going to happen, because it's not on me if I want to get vaccinated or not, right? There's a policy by the government that says that 45 plus will get vaccinated, elderly will get vaccinated, and this is something that has happened globally, not just in India, and also with all these reasons very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech. Just wanting to confirm if Shaheed Bhagat Singh College have joined us, the team from Shaheed Bhagat Singh College.
Yeah, we have.
All right, great. So moving ahead, I would like to invite the four speakers from Team St. Xavier's Mumbai to to take the stage and take the case forward.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yeah, you are.
You can see the background, right? All right. Okay, I'll give you a countdown and you can start the timer then. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Greetings to everyone present here. Throughout the course of my speech, I'm going to prove why this policy we are debating on is a need of the hour. And if we want to protect public health, which I think is the biggest priority in this debate, I think this policy has to be passed, which is why I'm very proud to stand on proposition today. There are 3 parts to my case. Firstly, the necessity of this move. Secondly, the benefits accruing out of it. And lastly, the comparative of why proposition side is so much more better. Onto the first point then, why is this necessary? We think the first wave of the coronavirus has already caused massive amounts of economic damage, and individual entities are just unwilling to sustain any more losses, right? Which is why you see a trend towards people wanting to start businesses back up or travel internationally for work or trade related purposes. So I think it has to be noted that regardless of whether you introduce the vaccine passport or not, people are going to want to travel abroad. However, at the moment, many countries and airlines require proof that international travelers aren't infected with this virus, and the regulations vary from place to place. And so far, there is no systematic requirement that people be vaccinated. I think the idea of a vaccine passport then becomes important. And this idea is just to create an updated version of the so-called yellow card, which is a W Health or like World Health Organization approved booklet, which documents your past inoculations. So vaccine passports show whether someone has been vaccinated or recently tested negative for COVID-19. This passport could allow people who can prove that they've received the full dose or who have already survived the disease and may have immunity that way to travel with fewer restrictions, attend events such as concerts or sporting events, and so on. I think given the prevalence, contagiousness, and devastation that COVID-19 has caused, there is this need for a more modern, digital, and secure record that can be standardized across countries, and that can be useful that way, right? I think this would act to both reassure border agents and also safeguard fellow travelers or event goers. Next, on to the benefits. I have two benefits under this. Firstly, the tangible outcome, which is that because the public has this need to like travel abroad and therefore they have this bargaining chip against the government, they are going to use this chip to push government to carry out its vaccination policy much more efficiently, right? I think because of this public outcry which pushes the government to act in much more efficient manner than it is in status quo, government has additional structural incentives which is why they're incentivized to vaccinate more people. I think whatever supply of vaccines is at the disposal of governments in status quo, it isn't being put to the best use. So this additional push from the public who wants to travel abroad and like get back their business, like get their businesses started back up and so on, that additional push is necessary to speed up the process. The second benefit I have is in terms of deterring actions of countries that could risk a third or a fourth wave of this virus. Here, I'd like to present the example of developing countries such as Malta, which are desperate to get their economies back on track, which is why they're going ahead and trying to incentivize tourists to come to their countries. They're offering like money for tourists to actually come and stay in those countries. And I think that this can have a ripple effect in terms of other countries also implementing similar measures because they also want to get their economy started back up, right? I think we deter these detrimental actions of these countries because we mandate the use of a vaccine passport if anyone wants to travel to any country abroad, right? Which is why I think we limit the spread of this virus to a very significant degree than would have happened in status quo. Lastly, on the comparative, even if you have to make a trade-off with economic development, I think public health has to be sacrosanct. You cannot risk the lives of older generations, right? Look at countries like the Czech Republic or Iran, where even like recently Iran, right, where most people came to that Shiite event, holy site of Mashhad home, and we think because these people weren't vaccinated, Iran's condition is really bad right now, right? Their health infrastructure is really struggling to like cater to the increased number of cases and so on. People are scampering from one hospital to the other to find ICUs. I think this visceralization of the misery or the like problems that people go through when trying to deal with this issue is something that has to be taken into account over the economic development that opposition might try arguing about. I think with all of those reasons, I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank you for your fine speech. Now I invite the speaker speaking against the motion from Team Saviors to take the stage.
One second, I was just checking. Yeah, let me know if this is audible.
Yeah, this is audible and you're visible. You can begin
Awesome.
whenever you want.
Give me a second. Cool. 3, 2, 1, let's go. I think the first harm that accrues out of this, in terms of you going ahead and fast tracking this process or serving as an impetus to go ahead and immunize, is the very fact that governments now want to get this done as soon as possible because of all things that government bends says in terms of public pressure and all of that. I think this also means that most of the vaccines right now get approved without going through clinical trials, phase 2 and 3. This is how hastily India went ahead and approve the Sputnik 5, even if knowing that the clinical trials in phase 3, which are incredibly crucial, aren't done. Which means at this point of time, you have more and more governments which go ahead and push vaccines through without conducting these trials. Essentially means that the side effects in terms of like people dying out of vaccine jabs, or essentially the side effects which are difficult to understand and realize simply because this disease hasn't been studied to that extent. These problems becomes way more exacerbated, point at which you hasten and fast track the process even further. We think this is I think that's a pragmatic harm that accrues out of it. But also secondly, I think they're not able to control it on their side simply because mostly because of mutations that are taking place, which means vaccines aren't capable of literally dealing with it. Most of the vaccines anyway have an efficiency close to 60 to 70%, which means you can contract COVID again subsequently. Because I don't think that stands significantly on their side. Firstly, in terms of international trade, and why do I think that's incredibly important? Most of the countries across the world, and mostly the most important stakeholders should be countries in the global south, that is say India, Cambodia, Thailand, all these countries which are grappling from COVID restrictions. We think most of the trade that takes place is in terms of people going ahead and doing those trades. These look like cross-border trades which are very prevalent, like between India and Nepal, or India Bangladesh, or between Thailand and Vietnam. These trades can't happen simply because these countries have a vaccine shortage, and that's a fact. Because most of the vaccines are hoarded by the West, they simply can't, government side can't claim that we have enough of storage or enough of supply to begin with. But secondly, most of these vaccines require sub-zero temperatures to be maintained. Most of the developing countries don't have such facilities to do it. But thirdly, in terms of basically in terms of hoarding vaccines from the West, means developing countries, mostly like India, can still have access to, but I think other countries like Cambodia or other poorer countries don't have access to the same, which means you can't go ahead and immunize so many people at a stretch. But this policy will be pan-international, which pan-nation, which means everyone has to apply it according to government's model. Which means at that particular point of time, this cross-border trade between developing countries like India, Bangladesh, or Nepal is much more likely to suffer, because these individuals can't physically go ahead and conduct businesses and operations. We think that's a harm simply because you don't let the economies of these countries come up. But secondly, we think in terms of tourism, most of the biggest source of India's foreign tourism is from Bangladesh. Most of Vietnam and Cambodia, source of tourism is from developing countries. We think you stop that industry simply because when most people don't have access to vaccines, because of the reasons I said, also because in terms of prioritization that you vaccinate only people above 45, which means the tourism industry greatly suffers at that point of time. We think that the bulwark of a lot of nations' economy, simply because they run cities, literally all of Cambodia's economy who used to run on tourism and people going ahead and visiting the Angkor Wat, which means at that point of time, these vaccine passports mean less people are allowed to move freely, which means tourism industry getting more subsequently hampered simply because of this. We think the counter measures look pretty clear in terms of travel bubbles or in terms of mandating quarantine facilities, which is at that point of time you still mitigate the damage, but you still maintain that the economic activities take place subsequently. But also in terms of logistical costs, making sure that this vaccine, this passport is given to everyone, but also maintaining surveillance of fraud also means that government has to spend financial resources to make sure that this kind of a policy is implemented. We think that's problematic when already government is suffering from economic damages. But finally, it simply means that more amount of rich people get access to these vaccines in these countries, and more number of rich countries get access to, say for example, this, which means that skews that global dynamic in terms of either international trade or, say for example, in terms of tourism that these countries can access. I think it's better off point at which you don't have these restrictions, because the harms are because the benefits on that side are inexclusive and the harms are pretty exclusive. Insanely proud to host.
I thank the speaker and the team from Xavier's. I now invite the speaker speaking for the motion from Team ILS to take the stage.
Can you please confirm if I'm audible?
You're audible. Can you turn on your video?
Yeah, I'm going to do that. Just 1 second.
Sure, sure.
Yep. Can you see me now?
Yes, I can.
All right. Just give me 1 second. I'll start. All right. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Distinguished members of panel, fellow competitors and speakers, good morning. Today, I stand by the proposition of the motion that this House would make vaccine passports compulsory for international travel. The novel coronavirus has impacted the world like never before, and there is a need to regulate and restrict most large-scale human activities in order to ensure that the virus does not spread. This is primarily because the virus spreads from human contact and aerosol particles, And the first effect of its global outreach and spread was seen through international travel when necessarily infected people transferred those viruses into countries which did not have it. First primary examples coming to mind are countries like Italy, India, etc., who face significant impact of the virus primarily because of international travel. We believe that now that through tremendous efforts, when we have curbed the spread of the coronavirus and moved towards a global vaccination program, we think there's a need to ensure reopening of international travel in the safest manner possible, which is through permitting such travel only through a vaccine passport. 2 points of clarification on the model that we wish to pursue. First, that we think that such vaccines would simply mean a stamp on your passport that you receive when you receive a particular dose of vaccine from, say, WHO approved vaccine, etc., or a certification thereof. Secondly, such passports will be issued immediately at travel point where you board a particular flight, not necessarily a tedious process altogether. Takes us to a constructive, first on the principle that we wish to pursue. We think that socially valuable activities must be regulated to tailor safety protocols in health. A very good example is that is already being applied in domestic levels is that allowing people to breach lockdowns if they are vaccinated, or say compulsory vaccinations for entry into large clubs and malls, etc. All of these things tell you that it's a principally right thing to do when you tailor socially valuable activities in a manner that benefits health policy to a great degree, especially in times of a pandemic. Finally, panel, we envision key benefits out of this regulation. First, that countries which have overcome COVID-19 will be protected from the reintroduction of infections through international travel. Why is this important? We think countries like New Zealand, Singapore, Iceland have spent tremendously on their healthcare in order to free their countries next virtually to zero on the COVID-19 pandemic and the people who are infected. This is important because A, they would either not recover at all if like a reintroduction takes place. For example, countries like Vietnam, etc., who did tremendously well but have weaker economies may not necessarily be able to recover if it introduces again. Or secondly, even if they're able to overcome these situations against, the fact that they've already caused like incurred the cost of this pandemic should not be made to suffer again in itself, right? But second, we think that such travel restrictions would incentivize vaccinations in regions where it has not been done. First, for example, countries like Brazil, etc., who have never prioritized these vaccination programs at all, will now have to do because international travel is contingent on it. Or second, that countries who cannot afford will now be more highlighted and will need to be assisted globally, which will increase their chances of getting vaccinated in the first place. Lastly, it will also incentivize vaccinations as individual people themselves would prefer it because they need to travel internationally. Panel, we understand that the opposition will raise concerns that poor countries are not likely to receive passports. But firstly, they need to prove why this is worse off than allowing them to travel and getting like creating more harms from other people and themselves. But secondly, we think there is more incentivization of vaccination on our side of the world. For example, now trading blocks will necessarily have to assist each other on vaccination because they know that if these poor countries within their trading blocks don't receive it, they cannot receive labor from those countries, cannot trade in those countries, etc. Good example, Asian countries necessarily have 51 million travelers within their country every year, proves that there is a need for inter support that will happen because of this policy altogether. We are very, very proud.
I thank the proposition speaker from Team ILS. I now invite the speaker speaking against the motion from Team ILS to take the stage, please.
Could you please confirm if I'm audible?
Yeah, you're audible and visible.
All right, just a second. I'll give myself a counter and then post it, I'll begin. I'll start in 3, 2, 1, go. This house will make vaccine passports compulsory for international travel? We think certainly not. Greetings, fellow debaters and judges. This is Tushar Rajput from ILS Law College, arguing from the side opposition. Prima facie, this just looks like a system of vaccine passport that proves whether a person has been vaccinated or not. But as with most things, the system becomes extremely complex and stomps on privacy and ethical concerns, along with creating a division in society when viewed more closely. In the past, a yellow vaccine certificate that the side proposition terms to be an upgrade from this is the reveal that most of these potential issues that include the idea of name, nationality, signature of the holder, number of the identity document, space for several entries for vaccination, the idea of manufacturers and batch of vaccine, the validity period of vaccination. I hope that you're tired of hearing these two. Then imagine the compliance with this system would be an additional burden for an already battling administration throughout this pandemic. This tells us that this is not a simple yes, I've had the vaccine question. It reveals some of the things that needs to be considered and reasonably considered to the limitations that the world has and will have for coming years. There are three elements at the heart of this discussion that we exclusively bring, which if not answered, will prove this house's decision to be problematic. Number one, the creation of a two-tiered society. Number two, vaccine nationalism and international diplomacy. And number three, medical ambiguity. The creation of a vaccine passport system, it could lead to a two-tiered society that explicitly exacerbates inequalities between vaccinated and unvaccinated population. So right now, vaccines are not equally accessible to all. So many states that report, for example, the wealthier and the whiter population, they're getting vaccinated at much higher rates than the low-income communities and people of color. So furthermore, this systemic inequalities in healthcare access pre-COVID, they have no doubt fueled vaccine hesitancies during the pandemic, particularly among certain ethnic and religious groups, minority communities, and people with disabilities. That requires digital vaccination passport for entry to public and private access places of businesses likely to heighten these inequities that the proposition is not addressing at all. My worthy speakers from the side of proposition would come up and say that this system would incentivize people to get vaccinated with a stronger inducement to travel. But pan, at what cost? They conveniently ignore which people. It will only incentivize the privileged who have the resources to travel internationally. And therefore, panel, the important question here is such disguised oppression of the underprivileged a fair metric for policy making? Certainly not. And it should definitely not serve as an example for further policies to come. These passports could lead to a global incentive for vaccinating international travelers before prioritizing COVID vaccine doses for vulnerable and swaths of at-risk communities around the world. And this two-tier system and this society is problematic to us. Vaccine nationalism is another knotty question. Which vaccines will count for the passport? Pfizer's, Moderna's, Johnson and Johnson's for sure. But what if you're a US citizen living in Canada who received AstraZeneca's vaccine, which has been approved by 15 nations, but not by US? So is this federal government willing to tell a whole class of responsible individuals that they cannot fly on a US plane? Or will the vaccine passport bureaucracy will be willing to approve vaccines that the Food and Drug Administration will not? What counts the proof of foreign vaccine? Some Asian countries, including China, creating elaborate and supposedly secure vaccine verifications using advanced information technologies. Good for them. But how would that square with US regulations or with some other countries' regulations? This confusion and infused diplomacy would mean that people cannot even go to better countries to increase standards of life. And this to its entirety will benefit developed countries and lock underdeveloped ones internally, because these vaccine nationalism millions wouldn't get the same. The side proposition would come up and say that vaccination passports could exist without sharing and personally identifiable health information. But making it work with a clear and verifiable standard of evidence is very unlikely in this scenario. We would conclude by saying that reliable and accessible proof of vaccine-induced protection COVID could speed up travel and economic reopening. But obstacles to wide-scale adoption of a vaccine passport system, as well as privacy and equity concerns, are so formidable that such a system would seem premature. We firmly believe that by the time the states ensure compliance and put forth a comprehensive plan of implementation, maybe it'll be rendered irrelevant by the success of vaccination programs. This is the reason we're proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker and Team ILS for their fine speeches. I request all participants to be mindful of the time. And with that, I invite the 4 speakers from Team SRCC to take the stage.
Am I visible?
Yes, you are.
And perfectly audible.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. To start off, I'd like to I'd like to thank the panel for my time on the floor. Today we're gathered here to discuss the policy decision of making passports compulsory for international travel. Firstly, allow me to define certain terms and set the ambit of the debate so as to properly contextualize the arguments that I'll be putting forth during the course of my speech. So, obviously, to begin with, let's discuss what a vaccine passport is. It is essentially a document that provides evidence that the holder has been vaccinated for certain diseases. The necessitation of proof of protection against certain infections can be traced all the way back to the development of the smallpox vaccine and the requirement of documents proving vaccination, vaccine scars, or a scarred face indicating survival of infection. This need for evidence of vaccination only rose with the advent of air travel and were enforced even in the 20th century. Smallpox has since then been eradicated, and that was mostly through the help of an extremely effective vaccine. Now, to set the scene in the status quo, the coronavirus pandemic is something that warrants no introduction. All of the people sitting in this virtual debate room today would have been sitting in an actual room had it not been for the pandemic. The world has been battling this pandemic for well over a year now, with the development of various vaccines bringing a ray of hope to large populations of people locked at home, unable to see their loved ones, unable to make ends meet, unable to live their lives without fear. Presently, the vaccines unequivocally better equip people's immune systems to respond to the infection. It's lowered rates of hospitalization and lowered rates of severe cases of COVID-19. There's also strong evidence to suggest that the more people that get vaccinated, the lesser the spread of the disease. Since the onset of the pandemic, the wait and race to a viable and safe vaccine has been closely watched. The wait is over, and now we have reached a point where there are certain goals to be achieved with respect to the number of people who are being vaccinated. I've now outlined for you the definition of vaccine passports. I've set a historical precedent. I've gone into a brief explanation of how a vaccine may answer the prayers of many during the pandemic. With this characterization of the motion in place, and with this characterization of the global situation today, allow me to briefly discuss how a policy making a vaccine passport compulsory for international travel can be rolled out. Firstly, such a move should never be permanent and should be enforced only during the pandemic. And secondly, we'll try to restrict the ambit of the debate naturally to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd now like to draw attention to the fact that restrictions will only be placed on international travel, which means that A, the vaccine guidelines within a nation are guided in a completely sovereign manner, and secondly, a large amount of travel, that is domestic travel, remains unrestricted. Now, what is the benefit of a limited restriction on travel? One of the current goals that most governments are trying to achieve is vaccinating as many people as possible, which is difficult for many reasons, such as supply but one other reason is a community of people who don't believe in vaccinations, popularly known as anti-vaxxers. From a range of reasons, from lack of trust to religious beliefs, some part of the population believe that it's better to go without vaccination. Now, how do you induce these stakeholders? Restrictions on travel are a soft policy nudge to incentivize people to get vaccinated without making vaccination mandatory, which is unfair for several reasons. Earlier in my speech, I discussed several benefits the public gains from vaccination. Where do these come into play for them economically and socially? Countries such as Mexico and Spain rely largely on tourism. Economies everywhere have suffered tremendously due to the pandemic, and any measure or modicum of safety from the virus will go a long, long way. This is especially true for the case of international trade, the most important component of the global economy, which has been suffering for a year now. The pandemic has come to a point where people are now willing to take huge risks to return to a modified version of normal life. A move that provides any degree of protection and that heralds the end of the nightmare that has shadowed our whole world is a move that should be strongly considered. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech. I now invite the speaker speaking against the motion from SRCC to take the stage. You're not audible, although I can see you.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay. If my connection breaks out in between, just either inform me. If I'm not able to be informed, inform Samika, because it might. So just giving a precursor. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Good morning to the House at large and Madam Speaker, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at this tournament. And the topic today in front of the House is the mandation of vaccines for international vaccine passports for international travel. So before going on to the argumentation, let's understand the importance of international travel, because I know proposition has already talked about vaccine passports and COVID-19. However, why does it why does the motion elicit international travel? Because the importance of international travel in an increasingly globalized world is a of tourism, and also secondly, people moving from one place to another to work, and for multitude of reasons. So international travel is an inherent net and a very intricate net which holds the international economy and is very important to people at large. And people more often than not travel from less developed areas to more developed areas, such as the US, UK, and that is, you can see in the amount of people who travel to say the United Kingdom or the United States each year. To understand this motion, where it comes from, to understand what is the aim behind this policy move for a mandation of vaccine passports. This mandation of vaccine passports comes from rich tourism-based countries wanting to resume the business that they lost during the pandemic and the lockdowns. And the easiest way to do so is to make sure that everyone there is vaccinated. Something which opposition agrees to, that uh, vaccinating people is a good thing. However, the problem is this motion is not that this house will vaccinate everyone equally. The difference is, and the inherent kink point in this motion is that COVID-19 vaccination has certain inherent harms, and mandating it has certain tangible harms to society as large. So while the economic aspect which proposition gives you might seem very rosy and very pragmatic, it is quite the opposite. Firstly, the supply of COVID-19 vaccines is extremely limited. And even when these vaccines are available in large numbers, they are bought up by developed nations, as can be seen with Pfizer, as all doses were already taken up by the United States, or as seen say, by Moderna, where it was taken up by the European Union. And you can see that countries which do not have the economic power or the social clout in the international community are now dependent on either say donations from lesser viable vaccines like the Sino vaccines from China or Sputnik from Russia, which are not clinically trialed and now left at their mercy. So supply is not equitable at that point in time. Secondly, supply is also not accessible. At a point in time when you put vaccines as something which is not openly accessible to all, you then need to prioritize, and that prioritization always leads to where the money is. And again, that also exasperates the inherent class divide nationally, wherein only privileged people get it, and also internationally, wherein only privileged people within privileged countries get it. So that difference in class is something which also then translates into who gets this right to international travel. Secondly, the extent of protection conferred by vaccination, particularly against new variants, as proposition has been talking about, is not well understood. These vaccines have been proven over a period of 1 year, where other normally vaccines take 4 to 5 to 6 years. This fast track process brings about an inherent uncertainty in people's minds. And while people might want to term them as anti-vaxxers, people are also cautious. That's why you don't mandate vaccinations anywhere in the world. There's no precedent for that. And that brings on to a third point. There's no precedent for a mandation of vaccines, because at a point in time when you're putting something in your body, there needs to be a certain degree of consent. At a point in time when the consent goes away, you're now being authoritative in that angle. It is lastly, the idea that it is similar to, say, there's a precedent historically of, say, smallpox and other diseases where people have been mandated to use vaccine passports. COVID-19 is different from, say, smallpox and other, because smallpox vaccines are more extensively trialed and they're more accessible, wherein India and US got them at the same time, for example. In conclusion, unless an equitable and optional decision is given to each and every individual in the world, we don't believe a mandation of vaccine passports for international travel, something as intricate as international travel, should be necessary. With that, very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker and team SRCC for their fine speeches. I now invite the four speakers from side Shahid Bhagat Singh to take the stage, please.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
And is my video visible?
We can see the background, but we can't see you. Yeah.
Okay, so just get me arranged. Now I'm visible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, so on my three, start the countdown. Okay, guys, good morning. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, start. Good morning, panel. As the speaker from the proposition side, I would like to start my speech. First of all, like in the status quo, where everything is changed, one thing that can turn every wrong into right, every negative into positive, and every pessimism into optimism is the vaccine passport. Panel, my speech will be based on the parameters of safe traveling, controlling the curves of the virus, saving time as well as money for international travel, as well as peace of mind and economy. So before starting my speech, I will quote the words of Sir Benjamin Franklin. An ounce of prevention is worth than a pound of cure. First of all, what are vaccine passports? Panel, let me explain that. Vaccine passports are the digital proof that is given to the people who are vaccinated and have achieved the immunity against the virus. In short, it is a digital proof of vaccination. As we have seen in the past, that COVID has spread from one city of China to the entire world and have led to economic loss as well as human deaths. But the countries which put travel restrictions on China in the early phases have performed pretty well than those who did not put travel restrictions. In the favor of the motion, I will elaborate 4 points, and my first point will be the base of all of my 4 points. Panel, let us introduce our first point. As the international mode of transportation is the airline, and they are tightly packed with passengers. So if a single person is positive in the flight, that journey can be a super spreader of the virus because it is not sustainable for the airline's business model to ensure social distancing within flights. Now imagine if every passenger has a vaccine passport, so it will be pretty easy for airline to give better services, and all other passengers will also have a safe journey, and airlines can also make journey profitable. Second point from our side is, my first point was the base and all arguments now will be taken forward. Imagine a positive person is traveling in a flight and then visits a foreign country where the person became the spreader. And imagine if hundreds of people do this, it will add hundreds of new cases, which will create economic as well as health issues in the country. As I have said earlier, travel restrictions were good at that time. Vaccine passport is good at this time. Third point from our side, it will save time, money, as well as preserve peace of mind. Imagine if people are traveling without vaccine passports. Some people, as well as fellow passengers, might not feel safe to travel. And people have to go through a lot of checks before boarding a flight, like temperature screening. So it wastes a lot of time. If people have vaccine passport, they can show the passport and jump the queue. And other passengers and fellow passengers will also feel safe. And airport authorities can save money by cutting these type of expenditures. Fourth point, and the last point from our side, is about the economy. As more people get their vaccine passports, so countries which are highly dependent on tourism can also revive their economy, and places like beaches, theaters, restaurants can be opened up, and people can enjoy their life without being affected by the fear of infected by the virus. With this, I want to bring my words to the end, proud to be on the proposition side.
I thank the proposition speaker for their fine speech. I now invite the speaker speaking against the motion from Team Shahid Bhagat Singh to take the case forward.
Am I audible and visible as well?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. Let me start off in 3, 2, 1. Vaccine passports, a magical pill to jumpstart the economy, or just a bitter pills of false hope? Let's find out. A hearty morning to all present. Here I am today speaking against the idea of vaccine passports as a mandate for international travel. Now, before I tell you as to why we shouldn't be supporting it, let me tell you exactly what it is. The vaccine passport, that is, it's essentially a certificate received against being vaccinated for a virus. It can be in the form of a stamped certificate or a digital document. Basic aim is to act as a proof that the person is, quote unquote, safe. And there are three glaring shortcomings for the idea and one sneaky one which makes it rather redundant. Now, starting with the scientific and expert concerns, which is that it is too early for the countries to start rolling these vaccine passports out, because please understand, case in point, India, which produces 60% of the world's vaccines, yet only 1% of the population is fully vaccinated, and there is already a vaccine shortage in multiple states of Maharashtra, Delhi, Punjab, Assam, and 6 more. That clearly shows the slothful rate of vaccination which the country, which is considered to have a decent supply. And that is very problematic. The other scientific concern is the emergence of new virulent strains which spread the virus even faster than ever before and is deadlier as well. From Moderna to Covaxin, these current vaccines are simply not offering any sort of protection against them. Now, these vaccines are safe. This vaccine passport is seen as a safeguard to protect the own people of the country, because they might actually invite a newer and deadlier strain in the false hope of a safety provided by the vaccine passport. And that is why it is very problematic. The next major concern which I have put forward is the idea surrounding the question of ethics. And oh boy, that's a big one, because please understand that this is an issue which even the World Health Organization says that the vaccine passports are a dangerous idea to implement for international travel. Now, vaccine passports are discriminatory against those who have yet to receive the COVID jab. Those vaccinated can travel and enjoy a number of facilities, whereas those vaccinated face restrictions. Experts have already told that considering the limited availability of vaccines, preferential vaccination of international travel could result in inadequate supplies of vaccines for the priority population, which is considered at higher risk for a severe COVID-19 infection, especially in poorer countries where your ability to vaccinate it simply depends on your level of wealth and influence in your country. And there is a situation of tremendous inequity in the world right now, and especially the idea of vaccine passports only further divides us and has a potential to hinder equitable global access to an already strained supply of vaccines. The inequity is hardest on the minorities and the marginalized sections of the society, as they have been the ones who have been the most struck by the pandemic itself, and this is a new way to further discriminate against them and shove them aside in the corners for some false hope of returning to normality in our pandemic stricken worlds. Last but not the least is the security and privacy concerns associated. Now, these digital certificates can be used by the authorities of a country to track the movement of its holders, and can be used by the nation states such as China, especially, to further crack down on any hope of dissent and any escape from China itself, thereby, shutting the door down on hope of a democracy in China. Not only that, this is the issue of hackers, which can easily force these digital certificates and potentially letting unvaccinated individuals slip through the net and be a big safety concern, which is considered to be a pro of this whole vaccine passport agenda. Throughout the whole debate, I've even yet to touch upon the idea of feasibility, and that is something which none of the government speakers in this debate have been touched upon, because we need a proper infrastructure, and that is absolutely required to even implement the whole idea of vaccine passports in the first place. And that is why which the feasibility is a very big concern which we have to address, because considering all the exclusive harms that are laid down in front of the house, it's rather imperative that we don't divide our society and not give in to the false hope and the promises of a vaccine passport. I do not know what the solution is. Is it better vaccines which are easily available, cheap to make, and has 100% efficacy, more vaccination, killing the anti-vaxxers, herd immunity, or a combination of all? But I do know one thing, that is putting barriers up is never a solution to a humane problem. And that is why I'm very proud to oppose the motion. Thank you.
I thank all the speakers today for this wonderful debate. I would now request all of you to kindly move to the main room and exit this breakout room. It was a wonderful debate, and thank you again.